Okay, break is over. Let's jump right in. So my name is Gerd Heber, and I work for the HDF group. And Elena and I, we stuck our heads together just to kick off this discussion of feature requests. And sort of the sources of that were multiple. One is we had sort of a little bit of discussion on the forum. We see what's coming through the forum. We have our weekly HDF clinics. And this is sort of a cross section of this. And there will be more in terms of a roadmap tomorrow. But the idea behind this was really potentially, rather than sort of grand features and fundamental changes, although the implications of some of the things that we'll be talking about in a moment might be no less fundamental, is that there are often, and anybody in this audience has probably experienced that than many other users, is there are sort of little things. They are just too tedious, too complicated. It's just little things. If they could just fix that, that would make my life so much easier, sort of coming at it a little bit from this angle. So we'll quickly go down that wish list. We'll talk about HDF sort of as the poster child for the ugly baby contest, which will lead us into tools, and then it's pretty much open floor, so anybody is welcome to comment, to add to this list, and so forth. But we thought, let's quickly run through this, otherwise we might get stuck on one topic and then run out of time, so I'll try to keep it brief. Okay, first up on that list in the forum was maybe do a revision of the filter interface, sort of things that live in H5Z. And the person who started that thread of conversation ideas was Lucas, who's going to present, I believe, tomorrow or the day after about HDF5 UDF. Very interesting topic, don't miss it. And he had some concerns about access to certain things when implementing a filter. These user-defined functions are currently implemented through the filter interface. And he was lacking things like access to the file handle from inside of a filter callback, access to perhaps the data space ID. If there was a selection, maybe that hyperslab, or have an additional callback to notify or to tell a filter when the data set is closed. And I invite you to go back to the thread. He lists also a few use cases there. And then I think Werner commented, and one of the things he commented on was there is also, maybe in the context of compression and so forth, a new generation of filters, if you wish, that involve some training, and that leads straight into, well, passing in parameters to a filter, a dictionary or something like that. So that's a whole other topic of questions. And then it came up today already, is his suggestion of enhancing the HDF plugin path and introduce something like a macro, this @0 notation, for example, that would indicate to the library that certain path names should be interpreted relative to the executable at runtime. And so this is a very interesting topic, the H5Z interface and so forth. It's definitely a very popular interface, and it's surprising that it hasn't really changed much, but maybe now or very soon is the time to take another look. Okay, another suggestion was by Nick Nordloch. He talked about this amalgamated source concept that he found in SQLite and Z standard and DuckDB. So the idea here was basically to, at least for release or certain purposes, to really amalgamate the complete source, in this case of HDF, into one giant source file, so to speak, and then really use that
Gerd, we lost your voice.
Gerd, we lost your audio.
Let me going ahead.
Are divided up basis. And interesting idea. He also commented himself that maybe that's not. Yeah.
Excuse me, but we lost that great idea. Your audio disappeared. So we probably 20 seconds of your, or 15 seconds, what you're saying.
That's terrible. Okay, but we were on this slide already.
Right. Right.
Okay, good. So this this idea of maybe for release or other purposes of amalgamated sources was suggested by Nick Knobloch, who said that other communities like SQLite, Z-Standard, and DuckDB, they use this to generally, for example, produce more efficient release binaries. And because, yeah, you have one large compilation unit rather than many smaller compilation units, and the compiler might be able to just do optimizations on such a larger compilation unit that it otherwise cannot do. And it's definitely an interesting idea, but as Nick said himself, it may not be practical for HDF5, but definitely an interesting suggestion. And yeah, we might want to take a look at that at some point. Okay, next one up is Fortran, suggested here by a gentleman going by JS11 or J11 in reference to the Fortran language bindings. Obviously, H5Py and Pi tables have in a way defined or redefined what HDF5 usability means, and Julia, R, C++, C#, and so forth, people in the community, some of you have created very idiomatic interfaces for HDF5, and it's not Fortran's problem or not C's problem, because in other efforts out there, my prime example would be ZMQ. People have created very idiomatic APIs in C and in Fortran. So the C API, that an API is in C or Fortran doesn't mean it has to be painful or of limited usability. And definitely something worth, I think, thinking about. I'm not even a Fortran amateur, so I can't speak to the technical background, how to make this happen. But yeah, definitely an interesting suggestion. Data types is another one. There are certain obvious candidates, and it's kind of weird that they are so straightforward in the sense of use and for how long they have been around, and they are really not domain specific. They are well understood data types, starting with time. We're not going to talk about H5T time here, which was sort of a botched attempt in that area. And but looking at what's the gold standard out there, my candidate would be the Chrono library in C++. So there are definitely examples out there that show that it can be, that one can deal successfully with a time type that's useful, with a date time type that's useful. And then it's just a matter of, yeah, thinking it through, thinking about how we can portably represent it in HDF5, but it's probably not, well, it's definitely not impossible. And yeah, we should just get over the sort of poor H5T time experience, but get it right this time. Next one up, Boolean. People have come up with all kinds of solutions that work for them, but I think a case can be made for having, I would say, two Boolean types. One, what I would call the narrow Boolean type, so just a simple true false, but then I think in practice people are also very interested in what I would call a wide Boolean type that, in addition to true and false, also can support the concept of missing, but then also meaningless, and the two are to be distinguished. that might be something. So it's just strange that we never had, not even Boolean, the narrow Boolean in HDF5. Ditto for complex. I remember sort of agonizing discussions where people, HDF group internal discussions, where people try to come up with all kinds of arguments why it is so complicated to deal with complex numbers. I just can't. I could never understand what was so complicated about it, and I think we should just do it and get on with it. One that's a little more complicated, but definitely on my wish list, would be support for physical units, and to represent that as a, if you wish, as an extension of the data type concept. Sure, you can have attribute conventions or whatever conventions to indicate physical units and so forth, and support unit libraries and whatnot, but it's all, if you wish, bolted on. And to me, if you want to combine that with something like compiler support, and you really want to take this to the next level, I think it should be rooted deeply in HDF5, sort of at the type level. And then last but not least, sort of talking about data types, the whole saga of variable size or variable length types, their poor performance, the storage overhead that they generate, that we currently don't compress them, which brings us straight into strings as case in point. UTF-8 support, people keep talking about it, and it's on everybody's mind several times a year, I think. The first step would definitely, for example, to straighten out the, I think, misconception that to a degree has been baked into the library, that ASCII is a strict subset at the byte level representation of UTF-8. There is, for example, I reference here a GitHub issue where a group somewhere found that our, at least as far as string conversion is concerned, right now the code says, well, an ASCII string cannot possibly be converted into a UTF-8 string, which is, in my opinion, which is wrong and unhelpful. And second step would be, sure, when it comes to where strings are kind of baked into the file format, take tags of opaque types, names of fields and compound types, file names referenced in external links in references, and so forth. There is a whole, at the moment, minefield of string involvement that we have to get a grip on, and start by just marking it clearly and understanding how difficult it would be to remedy these different places. And but then, even after we have done all that, the question would be, going forward, do other string encodings, would the support for other string encodings beyond UTF-8 really add value to the library, or should we rather rely on well-established capabilities like libicu and so forth? And that's a discussion to be had. Next up, HDF5 defaults. There was recently a discussion about the usefulness of timestamps. Then the defaults, for example, for strings, ASCII encoding at the moment versus going to UTF-8 from the very beginning. Chunk cache size, 1 megabyte, that was probably chosen at a time when 1 megabyte was a lot of data. And then more generally, the question, people are perfectly entitled to say, I don't like your defaults, your, meaning the HDF group's defaults. Can't we make them configurable in some form? And we heard today, for example, when we talked about pluggable VFDs, that yeah, with some of these environment variables, you can overwrite the defaults. Now, is that good enough, or really do we want to take that a step further and think about configurable defaults, not just for certain corner cases, but rather sort of at a sort of more cross-cutting level. H5, which brings me to H5 diff and tools. Some of these have actually very profound backgrounds. So there's always probably I should have done a statistic how many H5 diff bugs in double quotes are being reported per year or per month, and it just goes back to showing that logic played no part in the development of H5 diff, and that's not a requirement because we don't want the H5 diff manual page to be 500 printed pages long or something like that. So we don't want to get logic involved. But it goes back to this fundamental problem of when we talk equality, and let's assume we define difference based on equality, that it's really important that the context in which we want to answer that question is established. And to a degree, we have in HDF5 this concept of what I would call deliberate ambiguity. And so, for example, if we talk about 123, that is as an integer, if I represent that as H5T STD I32 big endian, or I represent it as H5T STD U8 little endian, are they the same? Well, the answer is it depends what the context is. If the context is arithmetic, yes, obviously they are the same. But if the context is HDF5 data type encoding, well, no, they are not the same. And likewise with strings, is the string foo encoded as a fixed length string of length 32 the same as the literal v that I could read from a variable length string? Are they the same? Well, it depends. Again, if I ask the question abstract about the computer science string data type, yes, of course they are. But if I ask at the level of encoding, no, they aren't. And that really then depends on the context. Let's say there is a convention or a specification that dictates that the encoding has to be one way rather than another way. So it all depends. And this is where this whole well, is this a bug or a feature? And H5 diff is really a case in point here comes from. And the question is, yeah, where do we go from here? It's not clear to me. Again, we don't want to make H5 diff the manual 500 pages long, but I think we need practical solutions and we need to think hard about that. Which brings us to HDF tools, what we like and don't like. There's definitely been some great work recently about the parallelization of tools, and I think we will hear something about that tomorrow or the day after. But on the downside, there are just the usual suspects. Our current tools, they are hard to use. Despite certain efforts, the naming of options is rather random. There's tons of duplicated functionality. They are not composable. So if at the cradle of those tools stood the idea of emulating sort of the pipe model and the Unix tools, well, that has gotten off the rails pretty quickly. The HDF5 data description language is useless because it's not programmable, and yeah, it's just a relic. And at some point we'll have to, I think take a hard look about fixing that. I mean, supporting it as legacy, but then sort of look for greener pastures. And they are definitely hard to maintain, and there are probably a lot of tools missing. But then going back, the question would really be, what do we expect from these tools? My personal expectation would be about 80%, another word for most. I would like to get most of my HDF5 plumbing work, so to speak, done without writing code, by just using tools. That would be my sort of hand-wavy definition of what I would expect from tools. And floor is open. So we've just sort of touched on a few ideas, on a few things that we have found in discussions on the forum and in email conversations and whatnot. But the floor is open. What would anybody like to add to that? What's annoying of the things that you have seen, of the things that we haven't seen that you have encountered? Feel free to speak up. And
thank you, Gerd.
I can't believe there are so many happy people out there.
So no, Wagner submitted question already. A reverse program is H5 clear-s, which allows to rescue many HDF5 files. Only files that are written with Swimmer, and only if you are lucky, because there are still problems. But I believe, yeah, there's no API that does it, because file is corrupted, and theoretically you cannot even open the file. You need to know where to go. And file corruption is, we're well aware, and I believe we have some ideas how to, and essentially there was some even prototype done for creating a log file that can be replayed, and a journaling file that can be replayed and metadata restored. And there are some attempts that are going on now, but we're far from solving this problem yet. Well, there are probably so many problems that people do not know where to start.
Yeah. People don't know where to start. Yeah, right. Or just start shouting.
Well, Vol connector is the ability to use default callbacks. Yes, we are coming with thank you, Lucas. This is a really good question. We are designing Vol development toolkit, and I think this will be part of this toolkit. So really what you, ideally what you will have, you take this toolkit and you modify only parts that you need, and the rest is working fine. It is wishful thinking, but we will do it. We're designing it, and we will invite everyone who writes Vols to contribute and review the design. Yes, Vol connectors, and Jordan may probably comment on Vol connector work, how difficult it is.
So if I understand right, Lucas's, I guess, feature request is that if you don't write a particular callback, it just uses the native implementation as it is now, and then you just write what you actually need.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's a pretty good idea. I think that would definitely be helpful. Yes, I very much sympathize that Vol connectors can be extremely complex.
These.
That's okay. You can always, that thread on the forum is still open. So if anything appears to anyone, just keep adding to it, and or open a new thread by all means.
And tomorrow I will be talking about other things we know and would like to implement. And on the last day, I will present what we are working in the nearest futures, our releases, which features are going into which release. So kind of our roadmap for the next 2-3 years. But it's good to know, because when we're working on different features, we're definitely trying to take into consideration if we can solve some problems while we're working on a big feature, this kind of leverage projects to help with things in the library and in the tools, in the interfaces.
Maybe if there are are any sort of Fortran savvy people in the audience? Is this what this user is asking here? What would
yes,
sort of a modern interface
yeah,
for Fortran look like?
Yeah, I can comment on that. We started Fortran interfaces really very early as library was developed. And at some point, decision was made just to concentrate on wrappers, mostly because of, at that time, it was compatibility with different Fortran programs. That was like Fortran, whatever interface was not kind of more object-oriented, was not very common. So right now, 25 years later, it's really well developed, and I think it's absolutely possible to design and implement nice high-level interfaces as convenient as H5 Pi. Looking at Fortran code, I'm terrified, frankly speaking, what people need to write. It's terrible. So we definitely can do a much better job. Said this, we minimized maintenance of Fortran library tremendously because we do generate most of the APIs on the fly. And it depends on compiler settings, it depends on the system. So from perspective of maintenance, current Fortran is really easy, but I understand the need for much better APIs because, as I said, it looks awful when if any difficult extended features are used in HDF5. It's a lot of typing.
And perhaps, I mean, this goes also a little bit in the direction of what Joe Swinsky was saying this morning, because in these, at least in Julia, definitely in Python, Node.js, C#, people have gone out straight to the specification and written what I think in those environments are considered very idiomatic interfaces, limited, same way as H5 Coro for now, but they went straight to the bytes and did what they needed and created sort of language bindings that are really idiomatic and so forth. And maybe there's probably, it's as with many things, there is not one right way, and having both options is to be preferred. That sure, if you want the full house, then perhaps going with a reference C serializer and deserializer and a little more is the way to go. But there is definitely a place for very idiomatic, sort of native, in double quotes, native to that language or that environment bindings. And
there is a question from Werner. What happened to cache save journaling feature? Is it still planned or add actor? So we reviewed that like a year ago and calculated that it will be probably 6 to 9 months effort to resurrect it, because one of the issues there was the usage of new metadata cache that now is in place. But with new swimmer development, there will be we're working on there will be a way to restore the file when a new swimmer, which is VFD swimmer, is used. Essentially, it's based on the same idea that metadata is, there are copies of metadata from which files can be restored by the tool. So this idea definitely is not abandoned, and I hope it will be, when swimmer VFD will be available, that feature will be available. And if Mike online, Mike, can you comment on this? Mike Falk.
Yes, I can. Sorry, it took me a while to unmute. We, yeah, actually, right now we're working on that tool. What will actually, well, certainly all of the pieces will be available to be able to recover after a crash. We're the VFD swimmer creates a metadata file and an updater file that will have all of that information. The extent to which the tool will be something that does everything you want it to do will be a different question, but it'll certainly be possible for people to create a crash recovery solution out of that. So yeah, we're actually working on that right now.
But it still will miss complete raw data recovery, right? It's only metadata. Raw data may not be completely recovered. Oh, Mike, I cannot hear you. I cannot hear you.
Yeah, the way it works is the metadata is going into separate log files. So that metadata won't be in the HDF file. The data may or may not have made it to the HDF file at the time that the crash occurs. So the data that's already been written or flushed or whatever, of course, will be there. But whatever is on its way at the time of the crash, you just don't know. Yeah.
So, and I mentioned that it's available with swimmer VFD swimmer feature. So the next step will be really to think how to make this kind of default or on demand so people can involve it. So this
Right.
is, I don't think we kind of worked on that step yet. But the first thing is to have VFD swimmer integrated.
Yeah, and I want to take this opportunity to encourage people to try out VFD Swimmer. We've put out 2 beta releases already, and we really haven't gotten much feedback from that. So please watch the forum, and whenever you see an announcement, or even now, go back and try it out. Tell us how it's working, what problems you're having. Yeah, give us some feedback, because we're really going into the the final months on that project, and won't have a chance to change much more under that funding that we have. So please be a beta tester for us.
Thank you. So I guess we are running out of time, but the discussion will happen tomorrow and day after tomorrow. So we'll continue. Please think about what you would like to see, and we always encourage contributions to HDF5, so we'll talk about it more. So thank you so much, and see you tomorrow at 9 o'clock Central.